"You'll never amount to anything in life, Elon. You're completely useless." These were the words that Elon Musk said to his 16-year-old son, looking directly into his eyes with absolute contempt. In that moment, Elon Musk made a decision that would change not only his life, but the destiny of all humanity. He swore that one day his father would choke on those words. Today, Elon is worth more than $200 billion, owns companies that are colonizing Mars and revolutionizing global transportation. But the revenge he planned against his father is much more sinister and calculated than you can imagine. And when you discover the shocking details of this family war that lasted decades, you'll understand why Elon Musk became so obsessed with proving his worth to the entire world. Subscribe to the channel now, because the story you're about to hear about the most epic revenge in modern history will leave you speechless. To understand the depth of the war between Elon and his father, you first need to understand what kind of man Elon Musk was. Elon wasn't just an absent or critical father, he was a pathological narcissist who saw his children as extensions of his own ego, existing only to validate his greatness. And when they failed to do so, the punishment was brutal and systematic. Elon Musk was a relatively successful electromechanical engineer in South Africa, owner of some properties and businesses. But his real talent was in psychologically destroying anyone who depended on him emotionally. He had turned his house into a psychological battlefield where he always emerged as the absolute winner. The dynamic worked like this. Elon established impossible standards to achieve, watched his children inevitably fail, and then used that failure as evidence of his own intellectual and moral superiority. It was a perfectly orchestrated cycle of abuse that guaranteed he always had victims available to feed his constant need for domination. But with Elon, something different happened. From a very young age, Elon showed signs of intelligence that even Elon couldn't deny. At 4 years old, Elon was reading books meant for 10-year-olds. At 8, he had memorized entire encyclopedias. At 12, he was creating computer programs that impressed experienced adults. This precocious intelligence should have been a source of paternal pride. But for Elon, it represented an existential threat. For the first time in his life, he was dealing with someone who could, theoretically, surpass him intellectually. And pathological narcissists cannot handle competition, especially from their own children. It was then that Elon made a decision that would shape the rest of Elon's life. Instead of nurturing his son's exceptional talent, he would systematically destroy it. He turned Elon's genius into his greatest vulnerability, using each intellectual achievement as an opportunity for deeper humiliation. The psychological warfare that Elon waged against Elon was sophisticated and relentless. He had identified exactly where Elon was most vulnerable, his desperate need for paternal approval, and turned it into a weapon of mass destruction. Elon's first method was what psychologists call systematic invalidation. No matter how impressive one of Elon's achievements was, Elon always found a way to diminish it. If Elon got a perfect score in mathematics, Elon would say, "Any intelligent child could do that." If Elon created a complex program, Elon would respond, "That's nothing compared to what I was doing at your age." But there was something even more cruel. Elon had realized that Elon had a photographic memory for conversations and began using this against him. He made elaborate promises about projects they would do together, praise he would give, recognition he would offer, and then systematically broke each of these promises. When Elon protested, Elon denied having made the promises, making Elon question his own sanity. The third element of Elon's campaign was even more sinister. He began to actively sabotage Elon's successes. When Elon won academic competitions, Elon forgot to attend the ceremonies. When Elon created something impressive, Elon found irrelevant technical flaws and magnified them until making the entire project seem flawed. When Elon showed passion for some subject, Elon ridiculed it as childish obsession or waste of time. But the most devastating aspect of all this was the unpredictability. Occasionally, Elon would be affectionate and supportive, giving Elon glimpses of what it could be like to have a loving father. These rare moments of approval became like drugs for Elon. He would do anything to experience that feeling again. And Elon knew this, using this desperate need as leverage for even deeper control. The result was that Elon grew up in a constant state of emotional hypervigilance, always trying to anticipate his father's mood, always looking for signs of approval or disapproval, always trying to be perfect enough to finally earn the unconditional love that every child deserves. But this perfection never came because Elon continually moved the goalposts. Then came the day that Elon would later describe as the moment my childhood died completely. It was 1987. Elon was 16 years old, and had just shown his father a project he had worked on for months. a complex video game he had programmed from scratch and planned to sell to a software company. The game was extraordinary by the standards of the time. Elon had created advanced graphics, an original soundtrack and gameplay mechanics that were genuinely innovative. He had spent hundreds of hours perfecting every detail, driven by the hope that he would finally create something his father couldn't diminish. Elon presented the project with a mixture of pride and terror, carefully watching Errol's face for any sign of approval. For a few minutes while Errol tested the game, Elon allowed himself to dream that maybe this time it would be different. Then Errol looked at his son, and with a coldness that still freezes Elon's blood decades later, uttered the words that would define the rest of their lives. "Elon, you wasted all this time on this childish nonsense when you could have been doing something useful. You'll never amount to anything in life because you don't understand what's really important. You're completely useless and projects like this are proof of it." But Errol didn't stop there. He continued for almost an hour, systematically dissecting every aspect of Elon's project, finding microscopic technical flaws and amplifying them until making the entire project seem like evidence of Elon's fundamental inadequacy as a human being. He finished by saying, "You'll never be anything because you don't have what it takes to succeed in the real world." In that moment, something fundamental broke inside Elon. It wasn't just disappointment or sadness, it was a complete psychological transformation. The child who had spent 16 years desperately seeking paternal approval died in that room. And in its place was born something much more dangerous. A revenge machine driven by a compulsive need to prove that his father was completely wrong. Years later, Elon would describe this moment as, "When I realized that my father wasn't just critical or demanding, he was my enemy." In the days that followed that devastating confrontation, Elon went through what can only be described as a psychological metamorphosis. He didn't become depressed or defeated as Errol expected. Instead, he became cold, calculating, and absolutely focused on a single mission, becoming so successful that his father would be forced to recognize his greatness. But this wouldn't be ordinary revenge. Elon didn't want to simply prove he was right, he wanted to completely destroy the narrative his father had built about him. He wanted Errol to spend the rest of his life knowing he had rejected and humiliated someone who would become one of the most important people in human history. The first phase of Elon's plan was educational. He began studying with an intensity that bordered on obsession, but not just traditional school subjects. He began studying strategically, learning about business, technology, psychology, and even about how to build and manage large organizations. Each book he read, each concept he mastered, was a piece in the puzzle of his future revenge. But there was something deeper happening. Elon began studying his own father as if he were an engineering problem to be solved. He analyzed Errol's personality, his fears, his insecurities, his sources of pride. And he began identifying exactly where to attack to cause maximum psychological damage. Elon realized that Errol derived his self-esteem from two main sources: his perception of intellectual superiority over his children, and his relatively privileged status in South African society. If Elon could destroy both these sources, he wouldn't just prove his point, he would leave his father psychologically shattered. The second phase of the plan was even more ambitious. Elon decided he wouldn't just surpass his father professionally, he would become so successful that he would make Errol's achievements completely irrelevant. He didn't want to just be better than his father, he wanted to exist in a completely different category of human success. And then came the cruelest phase of all. Elon decided that once he achieved this absolute superiority, he would make his father know exactly what he had lost. Not through direct confrontation, but through a public and undeniable demonstration of his own greatness. He would force Errol to watch helplessly as the son he had called useless literally changed the world. The execution of Elon's revenge began with a decision that shocked his entire family. At 17 years old, he announced he was leaving South Africa permanently. Not to study abroad as many young South Africans did, but to never return. It was a declaration of total independence, not just geographical but emotional and psychological. Errol reacted exactly as Elon had predicted. He ridiculed the decision as adolescent fantasy, and prophesied that Elon would return with his tail between his legs within a year. These predictions would become more fuel for the revenge machine Elon had become. The first years in Canada and later in the United States were brutally difficult. Elon lived in near-poverty conditions, slept on friends' couches, survived eating hot dogs and oranges for weeks. But he never considered giving up, because each difficulty was evidence that he was on the right path. Each moment of deprivation was an investment in his future revenge. During this period, Elon maintained minimal contact with his father, but always ensured that Errol knew he was still, trying to succeed in the real world. These communications were carefully calculated to keep Errol invested in the narrative that Elon would eventually fail and be forced to admit his father was right from the beginning. Then came the first real blow. In 1995, Elon co-founded Zip2, a software company that was sold for $307 million just 4 years later. Elon's share was $22 million, an amount that overnight made him richer than his father had ever dreamed of being. But Elon didn't stop there. He immediately invested everything in X.com, which would become PayPal. When PayPal was sold to eBay for $1.5 billion in 2002, Elon pocketed $165 million. At this point, he had conclusively proven he wasn't useless. He was, in fact, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. But it still wasn't enough. Because Elon's revenge wasn't about money, it was about legacy. He wanted to ensure that when history books were written, the name Musk would be remembered not for Errol but for Elon. And not just remembered, but revered as one of the great transformers of human civilization. It was then that Elon embarked on the most ambitious phase of his revenge. He decided to literally change the course of human history. And he would do this on two fronts simultaneously: terrestrial transport through Tesla, and space exploration through SpaceX. The choice of these industries wasn't accidental. Elon had identified two of humanity's greatest challenges: climate change and the need to become a multiplanetary species, and decided that solving them would be his final declaration of superiority over his father. Not just financial or professional superiority, but moral and historical superiority. When Elon founded Tesla in 2003, many people, including his father, thought he had finally lost his mind. The automotive industry was dominated by giants with more than a century of experience. The idea that a startup led by a 32-year-old South African could revolutionize this industry seemed absurd. But Elon had learned something his father never understood. When you're motivated by the need to prove someone is completely wrong about you, there are no limits to what you're willing to sacrifice. Elon invested his entire fortune in Tesla, worked 100 hours a week for consecutive years, and accepted risks no sensible businessman would accept. SpaceX was even more audacious. Elon was essentially telling the world, "Not only will I revolutionize terrestrial transport, but I'll also make humanity an interplanetary species." To any outside observer, this seemed like megalomania. But to Elon, it was simply the next logical step in his campaign to prove his father was spectacularly wrong about his capabilities. What makes this revenge truly genius is that it was structured to be inescapable. Even if Tesla or SpaceX failed, the simple fact that Elon had attempted such ambitious projects would already put him in a completely different historical category from his father. But if they succeeded, as they indeed did, Errol's humiliation would be absolute and permanent. The moment when Elon's revenge became complete and irrefutable can be precisely dated: May 30, 2020, when SpaceX became the first private company in history to launch astronauts into space. In that moment, watching astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken take off in the Dragon capsule, Elon had finally proven that not only was he not useless, he was literally one of the most important people in human history. But the true genius of Elon's revenge wasn't in the success itself, but in how he orchestrated the public response. He ensured that every major milestone of Tesla and SpaceX was widely documented and celebrated by world media. He became not just a successful CEO, but a global cultural figure, appearing on television shows, inspiring memes, and being discussed as a visionary who was shaping humanity's future. During this time, Elon Musk was reduced to giving occasional interviews where he tried to associate himself with his son's success, claiming he always knew Elon would be successful. But these pathetically transparent attempts to insert himself into the narrative only made more obvious the extent of his irrelevance. The man who had once called his son useless was now desperately trying to ride the coattails of the fame he had predicted would never exist. Errol's humiliation became even more complete when details about his personal life began leaking to the media. While Elon was being celebrated as a visionary genius, Errol was being exposed as a problematic man who had married his own stepdaughter, a revelation that destroyed any remnant of social respectability he might have maintained. But perhaps the cruelest blow of all was how Elon handled these revelations. Instead of attacking his father publicly, Elon simply said in interviews that he preferred not to discuss Errol, describing him as a terrible person, and making clear they maintained no relationship. This calculated coldness was more devastating than any direct attack could have been. What makes Elon's revenge against his father truly fascinating isn't just the external results, but how it fundamentally shaped his psychology and motivations. Every important decision Elon made in his career can be traced back to that moment at 16 when his father called him useless. Elon's obsessive need to work 100+ hours per week, for example, isn't just work ethic. It's a psychological compulsion born from the need to constantly prove his father was wrong. Even now, worth more than $200 billion, Elon can't relax because relaxing would be admitting that maybe he's already proven his point sufficiently. Elon's choice to focus on projects that benefit all humanity can also be understood through this lens. By solving global problems like climate change and making humanity a multiplanetary species, Elon ensured that his superiority over his father wasn't just personal, but moral. He's not just more successful than Errol, he's a force for good in the world, while his father is, at best, irrelevant. Even Elon's controversial public personality on social media can be understood as an extension of his revenge. Each provocative tweet, each controversial statement, each moment he dominates global news cycles is a demonstration of his cultural power, a power his father never possessed and never will possess. But perhaps the deepest aspect of Elon's revenge is how he completely redefined what it means to be a Musk. Before Elon, the family name was associated with a relatively obscure engineer in South Africa. Now, Musk is synonymous with visionary innovation, impossible ambition, and civilizational transformation. Elon didn't just surpass his father, he completely erased his legacy and replaced it with his own. But all revenge has unforeseen consequences, and Elon's campaign against his father created some psychological dynamics that continue to influence his life today. The compulsive need to prove his worth, which was initially directed against Errol, has now become an autonomous force that cannot be easily controlled. This explains why Elon continues taking on increasingly ambitious projects even after proving his point 1,000 times. Neuralink, the Boring Company, his acquisition of Twitter, all these ventures can be understood as manifestations of a psychological need that was never completely satisfied, no matter how spectacular the success. The revenge also profoundly affected Elon's capacity for personal relationships. When you spend decades living in a war mentality against the most important parental figure in your life, it becomes almost impossible to develop genuine trust in other people. This explains why Elon has had so many turbulent relationships and why he often seems more comfortable with machines and codes than with deep human connections. There's also the question of emotional satisfaction. Elon achieved everything he promised to achieve, he proved his father was completely wrong, he became one of the most important people in history, he redefined the Musk family legacy. But achievements based on revenge rarely bring the emotional peace we expect. They can bring validation but not necessarily happiness. The story of Elon Musk's revenge against his father is more than just family drama, it's a masterclass on how to transform pain into power, rejection into motivation, and humiliation into historical greatness. But it's also a reminder that the forces that drive us to our greatest achievements aren't always the healthiest or most sustainable. Elon conclusively proved that his father was wrong about him being useless. In fact, he proved it in such a spectacular and comprehensive way that it will be remembered for generations. But the psychological cost of this proof was immense, a lifetime structured around the need for validation through extraordinary achievement. Perhaps the final irony is that by trying to psychologically destroy his son, Elon Musk inadvertently created one of the great transformers of human civilization. His cruelty became the fuel that allowed Elon to reach heights he might never have reached under more loving circumstances. So, next time you see a SpaceX rocket taking off or drive a Tesla electric car through the streets, remember, you're witnessing not just technological innovation, but the physical manifestation of one of the most epic and successful revenge stories in human history. And maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us about the transformative power of proving our critics completely wrong. If this story of epic revenge and transformation inspired you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because we'll continue exploring the dark secrets behind history's greatest successes. Because sometimes, the most personal motivations create the most universal impacts.